like to make this interactive. We need some help here. The reference platform lead project is a proposal that we've made to the Linaro Technical Steering Committee. There are a number of questions they've asked, and we really want input from everybody who's interested in this project to give their commentary and things we should do, things we shouldn't do, and perhaps some lessons that we should learn. So Yang was going to give this presentation, but he's unable to come, and so I drew the short straw. There are 4 questions that I kind of started with just to frame the discussion. One is, what is the reference platform lead project? And then a couple of things that have come out of it. What hardware is it going to be delivered on? What's it for? What questions have people asked us so far about it? And then I'd really like to kind of open this for a discussion and any input everybody's got. So, quick background. The goal of this is to provide reference software end-to-end that's delivered on 96Boards products that can be used by members and the community to reduce the time and effort it takes to create a derivative product. And a derivative product could be putting the software onto a Raspberry Pi, it could be putting it onto a production enterprise server, right? It's how to get Linaro's output and upstream output more quickly and more efficiently to members and to the community. And this includes also the output from the groups. So if a group is working, take an example, if LHG is working on an end-to-end digital rights management project with Microsoft PlayReady, Widevine stuff, then and TrustZone and OPTE, how do you deliver end-to-end that people can actually quickly say, okay, I now understand how this is. I've got a reference piece of hardware, I've got reference software, I've got documentation, I can now use it for my application or I can move it on to something else. So the goal is to create kind of end-to-end documented use cases from bootloader to application using a set of building blocks and make it easy for people to use this software in other places. And also try and help use this as a way of improving upstream support for 96Boards products. So there are a couple of pieces of nomenclature I'm going to use. One is RPB, which means a reference platform build. And essentially that is what we used to do with PandaBoard, for example, in Linaro in the early days, where we deliver, as an example, a bootloader, a kernel, AOSP, delivered as a binary that you can just flash onto a high keyboard, but also documentation on how to actually replicate building that binary from source code. Another example might be UEFI, ACPI, CentOS, Hadoop, and maybe the H2O demo you saw this morning delivered as a build on Husky board, right? Again, documentation on showing how it was done, what was done that's not upstream, what was done that required some proprietary code or interfaces so that it can then be used quickly and efficiently to work on yourselves. And then a component is essentially a building block that comes out of Linaro to build those reference platform builds. So that might be OPTE, might be an OpenStack build, whatever. The plan is to kind of do this quarterly. And so we're going to try and prototype this in October. I'm not sure we're going to be ready on the enterprise board because of the delays to the Husky board, but we may be able to kind of do a preview. But for the CE version, the idea is to have open source bootloader, kernel obviously, initially Debian and AOSP, and then an OPTE implementation and an OpenJDK implementation. And the deliverables out of this are binary images for the supported boards, documentation on how to build them from source code, any additional documentation like, for example, in order to get the GPU going, here's what we had to do and here's where we got code from. If there's proprietary software for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, where do we get the build? Here it is. Here's how we put it in. Then also get the board running the release in the Linaro CI lab, and then have a test and QA report. And there's been some very good ideas internally on part of that report should be, here's how much out of tree code is in this build, so that we can measure it from release to release and see if it's going down. And if it's going up, we can ask questions. So this project is under discussion in the TSC, as I say. There is a proposed specification. Anybody with a Linaro address can take a look at the specification. And if you're not in Linaro and you want to look at it, let us know. Let anybody in the 96 Boards team know. And if you want to help us on it, we'll certainly open it up to you. And once the project's approved, we'll open it up to everybody anyway. And the idea is that additional functionality, new board support, and so on will be made available on a quarterly basis. So, as well as what I showed you earlier, just to get you thinking, the kind of things that we want to do here are take community builds and put them into the program. Build open embedded Yocto-based systems for embedded. Take a big data use case, take a secure media use case, maybe do a build that's robotics oriented or UAV targeted with some specific software. So what hardware do we deliver it on? The goal here is to deliver this on 96 Boards products. That may need member support, almost certainly will. And it will use deliverables from the Linaro teams. And then members in the community are going to be positively encouraged to use this as the basis of work they want to do on other boards. So, and we're even thinking in the 96 Board Steering Committee as to, could we basically in future provide a place where people can provide RPBs for their boards on this site, to try and ultimately build a single community that's working on these sort of low-cost boards so that we're not just replicating and fragmenting all of this work across every vendor's boards. You saw Simon's board slide with all of the embedded boards. Wouldn't it be great if there was kind of one place where everybody came because they knew this was the place to work on ARM community boards? Questions so far? Are we going down the path of, are we about to create a Linaro distribution here? And the answer is definitely not. We don't have the skill set or the desire, and certainly members haven't asked us to create a distribution. We don't want to deal with security patches. We don't want to deal with the business of supporting a distribution. For mobile embedded, we are providing an image which is an example, a reference example of an existing distribution at a given point in time. That will change 3 months later. We're not providing initially the ability to upgrade from release to release. So this is going to cause, if you start building a product out of it, you're going to have to take responsibility for that. And that's something we're going to have to discuss, because if you go from, if you have to reflash each time from scratch, that's not a very good user experience if you've gone and built a whole pile of stuff that you want to preserve and you have to back up first. Enterprise is different. I mean, the goal in enterprise is there is no distribution build required because the distribution just works and then you go from there. So for things like Debian, CentOS, Red Hat, you'll be able to, the recipe will say, here's where you go to put the distribution on. And then clearly we have to select a set of user space packages, and the goal here is to try and towards having the minimum set of user space packages so people can then build up what they want, rather than overloading it with everything and then using up a lot of space. What resources does this need from Linaro? Well, a lot of the resources to do this are coming obviously from the teams who are actually building the technology, which is the core teams and the segment groups. And what the 96 Boards team is going to do is essentially going to build and test and document this process. And landing team output is used to actually get these boards running. Now, the previous session, for those of you who weren't here, had some interesting and in some cases fairly heated comments about, yeah, but the landing teams basically work on member product trees. They don't work upstream. And for this program, we want to try and encourage that to change. And the more upstream, the better a compliance report you're going to get at the end of the day. That was one of, I think, Kevin's suggestions. So we have, is Ricardo here? So Ricardo has just joined Linaro, rejoined Linaro, I should say. And Ricardo's going to be responsible, assuming this goes ahead, and if it doesn't, he's still going to have to be responsible for putting software together for 96 boards. But he's going to be responsible for being the release overseer of this project. And we're also hiring a dedicated documentation person, because one of the things we want to do is make it easy for people to be able, for members and the community, to be able to take this output and put it into their own environment. And that's going to need a level of documentation that Linaro hasn't produced before, so we're going to need resource to actually put that in place. And we're also reusing the resources we already have for our systems for building CI loops for Lava and so on. We don't expect members to fund their competitors here. If there's dedicated work required for a particular board, we will expect that vendor to put that engineering resource in, either through a landing team or through their own resources. Another comment was, we shouldn't be spending so much time thinking about builds. That's what members do for products. We should focus on trying to solve some of the problems we have around standardizing interfaces across different SOCs. And I think that's actually a very good example of something that should be in a reference platform build. In the previous session, Scott and David talked about how do you create one application that actually opens GPIOs on any 96 boards board. Now, this may sound a completely trivial thing to do. Surely, in this day and age, you can make a GPIO work on more than one board with a single application. Well, you'd be surprised how much code it takes to make a GPIO work in upstream Linux. And you have to know an awful lot about the particular SOC to know what file to open in order to get access to the GPIO. So that's a very trivial example of where we could basically work with an upstream library to abstract the GPIOs from the application. And that would be a good thing that could be widely used across the ecosystem. Same thing for I2C buses, I2S buses, anything that's got MUX GPIO, and so there's a lot of things that I think we could tackle that would benefit everybody. And if you want to tackle a really big one, then let's play with the camera interface. Cameras are really hard in open source land, and we're finding this in Project Ara, where clearly what we're trying to do is create a platform where you can take out a camera from one vendor, plug in another one, and a third-party vendor can just create a camera, and it will just work. For those of you who know about how camera software is put together, that is a very hard problem to solve, and we're initially at least going to have to solve it by making the camera modules intelligent and having the ISP on the camera, because otherwise we're just not going to succeed. So the goal here is to document these components and builds so that they can be easily reused by members in the community in their own projects. And the last question was, well, okay, this is all very well, but isn't this what Linaro already does? How does this overlap with what the segment groups do? Well, the idea is that RPBs can be requested by a steering committee. So a steering committee may say, look, what we want to do is we've been doing all this good work on creating and benchmarking a use case for Hadoop running on ARM64. What we'd like to do is get this out into the community as the kind of canonical reference example, and then perhaps everybody will use it as a way of benchmarking their implementations, and we can start comparing. Interestingly, somebody once recently said, what, Linaro is now going to publish benchmarks? And there's been understandably huge reservations in members, particularly on new silicon, about ever publishing benchmarks, because benchmarks can be abused, as we all know, and that's actually the responsibility of the members, because their marketing departments like to control that kind of thing. The world changes when you have $75 boards that everybody can buy. And the world changes because somebody will go and run a complex benchmark on a $75 product that anybody can do. They'll mess it up. Thermal control won't be working, and the processors will be going at 200 megahertz rather than 2 gigahertz, and they won't know, and they'll publish it on a blog, and it'll be picked up, and all chaos will come back. Once you have community boards, the rules change. So if we, for example, publish an RPB and a benchmark, how we ran it, how you duplicate it, that's actually very valuable, because then that becomes a useful piece of information. And if we screw up and somebody comes back and says, well, you ran that wrong, you could have done it faster, we have the ability to actually correct it without it, but much better if we get it right in the first place. The point I'm making is that people will run benchmarks on these boards, so we may as well show them how to do it, create a reference implementation. So steering committees can request RPBs, is the point. And this is kind of how it looks. The internal Linaro groups in the middle, the segment groups and the core engineering deliver components. Think of OPT as a component. The SoC vendor works with the Linaro team, and the 96 boards team in Linaro take the components, take the SoC vendor's input, and deliver the reference platform build that is hosted publicly on 96boards.org, and there's documentation explaining how to replicate it, how we did it. It's a recipe. Okay, 20 minutes that took. We've got 40 minutes to have input and discussion, and I'm going to start with Leif.
Yes, I have. No, I actually think this sounds like a good thing, but I still think that there's a little bit of the embedded goggles on.
A little bit of the
embedded goggles. For enterprise segment, having known working firmware, bootloader, and by the way, it is firmware, it's not bootloader. Bootloader is separate, and kernel and userland. That's not the interesting bit. That might be interesting as well, as in if you get a new feature through your firmware which lets you have things to test, that's nice. What I really want is the 2 years old firmware that the new operating system still installs on. Yeah, that's the really critical one. That's the one we need to nail, because we have a very bad habit throughout the entire ARM ecosystem of treating firmware as software, and that needs to stop. So if we can do that, really what I would say is primarily we would want to enable, here's a fixed release of firmware. This is the firmware that's interesting, and we can release the rest as a block to test on top of that, and we do that every time. Every now and then, if we get a new firmware feature and we want to test that that works across the stack, that might be interesting as well, but that is order of magnitude less important.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with you first, and I'm gonna get my piece in before John starts talking, because then I won't be able to at all. I actually 100% agree, and I think we are further down this path in the enterprise space than we are in the mobile and embedded space, right? Actually, I think one of the big challenges of the kernel consolidation lead project moving forward is to try and, with ARM, create some standards for firmware that can enable the same principles. Wouldn't it? Some of you may turn around and say, absolutely not, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. Wouldn't it be nice if building an embedded product was like building a server product? You just chose your SoC and it worked.
Well, let's get it happen at some point.
And we have to make it happen, right? It won't happen without leading. John, you wanted to say something?
I did. You can buy these Tangled toys on Amazon. I've discovered a way to extend mine infinitely. This is awesome. No, I actually had something more interesting to say, I think, perhaps. Do you want to play with that? You can play with that. They're a lot of fun. So we actually ended up teaching some companies about this firmware issue of, where they would ship us something. Oh, yeah, you have to run the firmware from last week. It's like, no, you really you don't. We're going to run the one from 6 months. It doesn't work. You're going to undo what you just posted upstream, and you're going to make it continue to work. So we're having to beat people over the head. I have a lot of spirited conversations with people. I don't use objects, but it might help. I think this actually serves as a really good reference. So I'm agreeing with both of you. If you have a reference out there for how to do it, and you say, in the lab, we're not going to update the firmware with the latest release. We're going to test the latest releases and all this stuff, but yeah, you're actually going to run one that's a year old on the 96 board, the first enterprise board, in a year from now when we look at it and say, remember that quaint board we launched, now we've got X, Y, and Z as well, right? You want to keep running, you want to keep the old stuff tested. I think this is actually a very positive thing. So, agreeing with you.
And if I can add another slightly related thing, for documentation. Documentation, good. We want documentation. For enterprise, if we need more than one set of documentation, we've failed.
So you mentioned the difference between your strategy for enterprise and embedded was that you would be using the upstream distributions for the enterprise style case, and you'll be shipping semi-customized distributions for the embedded style case. Why? What do we have that differs so substantially that requires that? And if that's the case, surely that's harmful to do so.
Well, if you think about open embedded in the Octo, it isn't a distribution, it's a way of building a distribution. Right?
So just, you specifically mentioned Debian. What would be tailored in Debian for an embedded use case?
So Debian, when we ship Debian on 96 boards, for example, what does that actually mean in terms of user space? Do we enable the GPUs on the particular board, or do we leave that for the poor old end user to have to go and follow a recipe to download it from some website and sign an NDA and all the rest of it? On the user space, there are going to be a small number of facilities or features that are going to be needed, I suspect, for each board. I mean, that's what, when you ship a product, you're going to need. I would like to see that be the minimum. And for something like Debian and CentOS that just come out of the box, we shouldn't need to do anything. You're absolutely right.
Okay, so
We're not looking to do anything.
So sorry, just to further that one step beyond, if that's the case that it's just for enabling the features required for these boards, does that mean there'll be a single file system image, or is the plan to ship an image per board?
It's really interesting that what we're finding on the first two boards is we're actually pretty close, if we haven't done it already, to having a single user space image that runs on both. We just take a Debian build from one and it runs on the other.
Can we mandate that?
Can we mandate it?
So,
I would love to see that.
so to take the Debian one a step further, the difference between enterprise and embedded is enterprise, you ship an installer and it installs. Embedded, you run Linaro Media Create and create an image on your host and then install that. And one of the things Linaro Media Create does is handle all the differences from board to board, which is another axis of firmware changing. There's firmware versions changing on one board, but then there's firmware across boards behaving differently.
And then Brian had a question.
One more thing on that though. So enterprise is stodgy and boring, right? I mean, I work on enterprise, so I can say that, right? So the point is, if with an enterprise system, if you get a board, it's the software that's been built. You give me a board, my software better work on your board. That's the model, right? That's not the model that happens in embedded. I support the idea of a single file system. I think it's a good thing, but for a lot of the embedded use case, if you say, well, you can't use that camera because I don't support it, you want to have a lot faster moving. It's a different market. So I don't think you can quite apply the same calculus between the two.
For enterprise, you can almost say, here's the bootloader source code, right? Here's the version of the distribution that installs itself on this board. Go knock yourself out.
Right.
If it doesn't work, come back and tell us.
Yeah, it's the hardware at
Tell me
fault
what
if
you're
the
saying.
OS doesn't boot.
Yeah.
But it's the other way around in embedded.
Right.
Is what I'm
Embedded,
saying.
you have to provide the whole thing, right? And on a 96 boards consumer edition board, you can't not provide the software. Well, you can, but it's pretty inconvenient for the end user. Brian, you still have a...
I just had a quick comment on the firmware issue. I really agree with everything you're saying, that it should be that way. And for the enterprise side, I definitely see it going that direction. But at least on the consumer side, I'm not really seeing that, at least from the community. What I've seen in response to what kind of Qualcomm has been doing is people saying, no, we really don't like your firmware. You guys have to go back and change that, from a year or two ago, so that we can, run our new software on top of it, kind of thing. So to me, it's a little bit mixed. I would like everything to be kind of the way you guys are describing as well, but I don't think we're there on the consumer side yet.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Rob said. So the consumer edition has a different bootloader. They have different partition. So it's not that easy. It's not standardized. We have one single root file system at the beginning, but we use some tooling to just make it match whatever partition is requested by the bootloader.
Standardized partition tables would be good.
Yeah, I have some comment on the enterprise board. I think when we make an enterprise board, we need to identify what specification it follows, right? So UEFI interface, what protocol you're supported. Are you supporting SBBR, right? All the requirement, if you are follow what type of SBSA server machine. So this is the key issue. So if we make, say, AMD board, we will see this is SBSA type 3 and support SBBR, but we identify what is not supported. It may be hardware issue, maybe firmware issue, maybe software issue that people can follow and fix these things later on. So that's my recommendation.
The reason I'm standing here is to throw in that when you're on the stage, you can't hear because all the sound is going that way. I actually agree. I think that's why documentation is going to be so critical for this project, because what we really want to do is actually, it doesn't matter what hardware it's running on, it's just repeatable on a low-cost piece of hardware, and here's how we got it to work, whether there's hardware workarounds or, God forbid, firmware or software workarounds, and here's how you replicate it on your own hardware. Because at the end of the day, nobody except AMD, if you're an SoC vendor, wants to run it on AMD hardware. You want to run it on your own hardware. But we can't run it on everybody's. So what is supported, what isn't, what the functionality is, and what the recipe is from starting from upstream to delivering this RPB is a critical part of documenting what we're doing.
I need to get exercise somehow.
So this may be a dumb question, but I'm wondering what the definition of the enterprise edition is, because is it a server grade, SBSA class hardware? And so if that's the definition, then yeah, maybe it's just specifying a specific reversion.
So think of it this way. For an enterprise, here's an example. Look at the demo that we did this morning with the Hadoop and H2O, right? The enterprise, in the ideal world, we don't actually have to deliver anything for the enterprise version, right? It just works. But if you think about a use case of Hadoop is changing faster than you can, so is OpenStack, so is all of these big open source projects are changing at a phenomenally fast rate. So at a specific point in time, if you want to replicate a set of functionality and then benchmark it and have a reference point, you need to actually take, let's say, Red Hat's preview build, you need to take your SBSA system, you need to actually configure it, you then need to put a version of Hadoop on it with any patches that have got to be put on, you've then got to put your end user application on, you've then got to run it and benchmark it. So documenting all of that, what we did so that somebody can repeat that, is actually hard today. Because if you wake up the next day and do a new Hadoop build, something will change.
So what you're talking about in that case, though, is just a server reference architecture that almost has nothing to do with the actual Enterprise Edition 96 board, because that same software stack would run on any server that met the same specification.
Yes, but it will behave differently because it'll have a 10 gigabit Ethernet rather than a 1 gigabit, or it'll have faster disks attached to it or whatever. I mean, the point about this is to create a use case that can deliver effectively a use case that can replicate work that Linaro has done. So in the enterprise space, let's say we're doing work on making Hadoop faster by optimizing OpenJDK, just some of the JIT libraries, and we do some work to optimize. Now, obviously that goes upstream, but there's a timing issue between, okay, John's release from July, right, that everybody's running is different from the one that he's previewing for October or next year or 2 years' time. So at any given point in time, there'll be a snapshot that anybody can actually replicate, and I think that will be very valuable to people.
The other side of it is that the reference provides the. When did Mike?
Yes.
All right. Well, so Linda's absolutely correct for the OS side. So you'd be running like CentOS or something as the OS. But for the other side of the firmware, I don't want to say software, but the firmware side of it, that firmware is something that would happen as part of 96 boards, but the input here is that additions to that firmware might be done through this project. So for example, if we standardize a new SMC interface, if we finally standardize NMI or deal with some RAS features or something, they'd be implemented in this, the firmware would be updated to implement those, and then the software would be collaboratively reworked to support that, and this would be the reference platform for that. So then that same software would still boot on an M400 or some other platform, but you'd have a reference platform. So the piece that I'm really excited about here is the reference firmware, the reference platform. The OS is the OS as far as from my viewpoint, whatever you want to run. But there is that ability here to provide good standard practice for how to do the firmware and so on as well, which I think is very important. And Leif may have a comment
So
on that.
interesting, actually. Yeah, you end up with focusing on two areas. You focus on the firmware at one end of the scale, right? And at the other end, you focus on the fast-moving open source use case projects like OpenStack and OpenNFV and those kind of things. And then each steering committee will say, we're all interested in OPNFV running on X. Let's produce a reference implementation of this so that everybody's starting from the same point. Leif?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, and this would also be quite a useful vehicle for finding things like when, I don't know, the next time MySQL decides to drop half the barriers because they don't understand what they're for, then we'll find that. If we base our builds on Debian testing around stable, for example, then we'll spot that as soon as it goes in upstream, and we'll actually find it and fix it before it causes issue for anyone else. And we can release the fix as part of this distribution and still have it working, even though it's broken upstream currently.
Please don't say this is a distribution.
No. I mean, we fix it
I agree.
in the distribution,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
then we
Okay.
release it.
Got you.
Next question.
How do you envision the different partners to create these RPMs in the sense of, with John's distribution, an EE board, and, is it Linaro that's going to bring these all together and then publish them, or is it contributions from both sides?
So I think initially the view is that the steering committees will decide on the, I'm going to get feedback. The steering committees will decide on what they want to see in each quarterly release, right? So they'll say, we want to see this running on an AMD 96 boards, or this running on a Hikey or whatever it is, or a Qualcomm Dragon board, or both, or all, and it will have this functionality, and then we'll put that together and we'll publish it openly on the community with documentation and the recipe of how we did it. As I said earlier, what we're thinking, but part of that is that for some builds and releases, it may require some input from the SoC vendor, right? We may need some code as part of that to be updated by the SoC vendor, so we need their support in this process. In the longer term, I would like to see an ability for the community to add to this project. So the kind of bigger vision of this project is that we'll actually have the community putting components into RPBs, and then potentially even, well, obviously it would be relatively easy for a third-party distro to say, okay, I tested it on my distro and it works, and here's some documentation if it's even needed, and tick that we'll add it into the Linaro Lava implementation as an example. So I think we need to take this step by step, and we need to try it first, tune it, see if it actually meets the needs of our members first, and then start working out how to get more and more community contributions. That would be my plan.
So for the overall software ecosystem that you're describing, there's going to be different layers of dependency, and whether you have to have your RPB stack all the way down through the bootloader, or whether you have application level or even just container enablement, for instance, you could create software from a third-party ecosystem that can sit on top of any particular layer, depending that you have the support underneath that. So I'm trying to understand how you would open that up so that you can have a broader ecosystem of software without narrowing it down to a very narrow specification.
I'm not even going to try and answer that one instantly. I agree with you. I think part of this is there is no point in producing an RPB unless somebody wants it, right? So I think one of the things we're going to be looking for from the steering committees and from the core engineering team is to say, are you interested in this? And if so, what should the LHG, and I can guarantee you the LHG one will look completely different from the enterprise group one, which will look completely different from the embedded group one.
I agree. You also mentioned, though, the community ones, which would be contributed, and those, again, would need some sort of sense of
They'd need guidelines.
What do you depend on? Yes.
I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about is maybe we should have a compliance test of some kind, and part of that compliance test should be kind of how close is it to upstream, how much upstream components does it use, how much doesn't it, and how do you get there? We have relatively small resources initially on this project because I think quite rightly, members turn around at all of the steering committees and say, where do we want to put our resources? And so initially, new projects like this tend to have a relatively small amount of resources, and therefore you need to contain the scope. But I think if we start it, go through one quarter, see what people think, then discuss it in the steering committees and define the spec for the next quarter's release, and build on this. And as I say, one of the whole concepts behind lead projects is that as members find this more valuable, they'll start putting engineers into the project and the project will get bigger. And the vision that I see for this is that it could actually turn into something very big for the whole ARM ecosystem across multiple boards. But that's not going to happen overnight. But yeah, I need your help. Kettle.
And so how is the initial scope going to be decided?
Glad you asked that. Microphone shuffle. So there's an initial proposal sitting on the website. If you don't like it, that's absolutely great. Send your comments to Yang, right, the director of 96 boards. And I understand that you're from Qualcomm, and the initial reference was initially targeted at HiKey. If you think that we could deliver something without a super amount of resource on our side that would help you on the Qualcomm board, we'd be delighted to do it, right? So send a comment to Yang or question to Yang, and then the steering committee will vote on it. But yeah, so the idea is this is not Linaro-driven, it's member-driven, and it's done through the steering committees. The timeline, well, what we'd like to do, we kind of wanted to do a preview here at Connect and then the first one in October. I think that may be a bit aggressive. It would be nice to get something out in October. Because at the moment we have the 96 board snapshots and releases. So I think depending on how quickly we can persuade the technical steering committee that in some form or other this is a good idea, assuming we can do that, realistically we're looking at kind of preview builds until probably a little bit later. So maybe the first one that will be a formal one, maybe we're going to have to go through some beta versions of this before we get to the final one, so the first one. But the idea is to probably do them on about a quarterly beat. And maybe that's wrong as well, maybe we should. But again, input would be useful, is quarterly right, daily snapshots, quarterly releases. Any other comments? So this is something most of you in the room know are from one of the Linaro member companies. If you're not, then if you've got any input in this, please send it to yangz@linaro.org or Ricardo. And if you are a Linaro member and you have input, then find your steering committee representative and either ask them to invite you to a steering committee meeting or tell them what you think we should do or we shouldn't do, and we'll take that input. Leif.
Isn't Yang Zhang at Linaro.org actually a different person?
Yes, so the funny story here is, and I actually made this mistake myself. So Yang Zhang, Y-A-N-G, Z or Z-H-A-N-G, there are actually two of them in Linaro. One is actually an ARM assignee who's a lady who is currently on maternity leave. And the other, and she actually started as an assignee in Linaro before Yang Zhang arrived. So Yang Zhang arrived, and we said, well, we need an email address. It's obviously yang.zhang@linaro.org. And suddenly this email came back saying, we sent an email to Yang, and suddenly this email came back saying, I'm on maternity leave. So I rang up the IT department and said, I think something's gone wrong here. We just hired a man, and he's apparently on maternity leave. It turns out there are two Yang Zhangs in Linaro. So at the moment, precedence applies, and so the ARM assignee is actually yang.zhang@linaro.org, and it's very confusing. She's getting a lot of email from about something that, I think she's in the toolchain group, that's something that she has no knowledge of. But Yang's address is actually yangz@linaro.org. Yes, he also has yang.zhang@96boards.org, but that's even more confusing. I don't know who thought that one up. So yeah, we need a better email. It's the first time we've actually had first and last being the same. So yeah, IT systems problem. Aren't you in charge of IT systems? Only for engineering.
I'm doing the engineering side.
All right, we'll hand that one to HR.
If you want me to handle it, I'll handle it.
No, we'll hand that one to HR.
You might have an IT department hunting you and me.
Any other questions on topic? All right, well, thank you very much for your time, and we really would welcome any further input. Thanks.